how's your stress level? Because stress will play, it's not called stress incontinence for, for no reason. And it's not just about the pressure in your pelvic floor, right? It's also about the physiologic stress that we're carrying. And so
Yeah.
as you're working with women, what do you see is the physical and emotional impact of some of these issues?
Yeah. So when we think of a muscle, so if we're talking about the muscles in our thighs, it's easy to sort of think about a muscle being too weak and therefore it doesn't do its job. And so our thought process is, I need to do some exercises to strengthen it. But our pelvic floor muscles, and this is a group of muscles that starts in the pubic bone at the front and goes all the way to the back where the tailbone is. So almost the shape of a basket maxi pad sort of shape. That's where these muscles exist, and they're within inside the body. Their job is to provide bladder and bowel control. They provide lift to prevent things like prolapse. They act as a stabilizer with the rest of our core, and they have a sexual function. But these muscles are not like your thigh muscles. So, you're sitting in a chair right now, Andrea, your thigh is relaxed because you don't need it to work. But when it's time to get out of the chair, your brain tells your thigh, squeeze, and that's what lifts you off. But our pelvic muscles are what we call autonomic. They're working behind the scenes, much like your heart is. So you're not asking your heart to pump. You can't pause it. And your pelvic muscles are the same. They're working all the time. If not, you'd be peeing sitting here right now. But the same things that increase our heart rate when we are stressed, when we are rushing, when we don't sleep well, when we are anxious and worried about something, also give us dysfunction in the pelvic floor. And the
Wow.
reality is a lot of women think that if I'm having pelvic floor issues like leakage, like prolapse, that I need to do Kegel exercises, I need to squeeze. But the challenge is, the research actually says the majority of women have too much tension in our pelvic
Yes.
floor. Yeah. And
Yes.
so if we do Kegels, it makes it worse, right? So understanding that it is more than just simply squeezing these muscles that's necessary to get proper function. And so
Absolutely.
that's that emotional health too, acknowledging that when we are redlining it, these things like leakage, pain, heaviness are going to feel amplified. Yeah.
No, I love that you talked about that because I think it was one of your reels where you talked about that, and I was like, no way. Because I have been really frustrated in the past with, like, I'm doing all the Kegels, like I can't even like get any kind of, there's no connection happening there. And it wasn't until I started working on my abdominal core and my stress that I was actually able to engage my pelvic muscles. But I love what you said about it being too tight, because a lot of times I would guess, without being the expert in this, because you're the expert in this, I would guess that just like we clench our muscles or our jaw when we're under stress, or our neck muscles will start to tighten up. It's a physiologic response that we're not always aware of, right? And so I would
Absolutely.
imagine that the pelvic floor is similar to that.
Absolutely. It responds without our awareness. And actually, there's a lot of research about the clenching of the jaw and the clenching of the pelvic floor. Oftentimes, we can let the pelvic floor go by simply unclenching the jaw. Many of us don't even
Wow.
realize that we're holding our pelvic floor. But again,
Mhm.
that is just, again, a physical sign that is then tied to some of that emotional and stress component that's there. So it's so hard to separate one from the other. You really can't address it without all of it.
Exactly. And I think that that's where, similarly to how we address hormones, like we can do all the things. I can tell you to eat all the vegetables. I can tell you to go, make sure you're going to bed at 9 o'clock every night. But if we're not addressing not only the physiologic stress you're having in your body, but the emotional stress
Mhm.
and how you're processing it, you're really only going to get that partial, right? Like partial traction, like 80% healing instead of 100%. And so when you're working with somebody, whether that be, in your clinic or in one of your, coaching practices, how do you kind of holistically address that with them to make sure that they're looking at all of those different pieces?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing with that stress is that when we're having any kind of dysfunction, so when these muscles are not doing their job properly, it shows up in a very physical sort of way, and that itself can be stressful. So, the example of a woman who can't do an aerobics class because she's leaking pee, well, now she's going to be thinking, okay, I'm going to go pee right before the class starts. I have to wear black tights because, anything else and you're going to be able to see the pee. And now
Totally.
everybody wants to go for coffee afterwards, but now I'm worried I smell like pee. Like there's all this stress and thought. And then maybe I'm going to decide maybe I'm not going to go to the class anymore because I can't do
Mhm.
all of those things. And that very stress and emotional thought process then further perpetuates the urgency and the frequency and the leakage that happens. And the same thing happens in the bedroom. If I'm worried that sex is going to be painful, my body is
Mhm.
tensing up and I am going to have discomfort and pain before we even engage in any kind of physical intimacy in anticipation. So you really do have to address both of those things, but it starts by really unpacking what's going on in your thought process. And that's really what I
Mhm.
spend a lot of time with women understanding. How is this showing up in your life and what is it preventing you from doing, and really unpacking what the impact of that is on you emotionally and spiritually.